Mr. Obadiah was a good man. He lived with his wife, Mrs. Obadiah, and some children. Now, we'll have some children in just a minute. Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah and some children. Mr. Obadiah heard some bad news. The king of his country was getting married. Now, it's not bad news for a king to get married, is it? But why was this particular news bad news? This particular news was bad news because the king, Uncle Ahab, was getting married to someone who didn't really follow God. This lady decided that she wanted to follow a different way of living. In fact, she hated people who worshipped God. This new queen wanted all the people to worship false gods. When Uncle King Ahab got married, he stopped worshipping God too. And instead, he started following all of the practices of his wife and his wife's people. And I'm sorry to say this one, but when that happened, lots of people got hurt. Some children got hurt. Lots of people were very sad. And you know what? God was very sad too. Just a quick little pause in this story. When mums and dads, when us adults, when we stop placing Jesus first, people get hurt, don't they? Children get hurt. Adults get hurt. Lots of people get hurt, whether it's we're stuck on some kind of entertainment, or see the guy in the top right-hand corner there, he's so busy with all of his phones and tablets and work stuff. He's a busy man, he's working too hard. The people in the bottom of the screen, they're having a hard time too. They're fighting and carrying on. Because when you put anything ahead of God, things tend to fall apart. Now, back to the story. Uncle Obadiah, this servant, this good man and his wife, they heard some more bad news. And I'm sorry the screen's not very bright, but you'll have to just imagine, mums and dads, if you can see the text there. 1 Kings 18, 1-16. Uncle Obadiah learned that this new wife, the queen of Israel, was trying to kill God's people. Uncle Obadiah and his wife decided they needed to help hide some of God's prophets. So they got 100 of these prophets and they divided them into 2 groups and they hid them in a cave. Good job, Mr. Obadiah. You can go and sit down for a minute and go and hide those people in a cave. And Mrs. Obadiah, you might need to go and help Mr. Obadiah because his hands are pretty full. Now, we don't know. This is a picture of a field that's all kind of gone dry. All of the crops are dying because John couldn't get the water out to the crops in time. It wasn't John's fault, by the way. It was a big drought. A big famine came over the land. And as these men were hidden in 2 caves, 100 men, we don't know how long they were there for, but we know that Uncle Obadiah and Mrs. Obadiah, they had to get their own money together to help pay for those men to survive, to pay for their food while they were secretly hiding in the cave. And don't forget, it's expensive to feed 100 people, especially when they're hiding in secret, and especially in the middle of a big famine like this. That's not good news, is it? Now, who likes to do mathematics? Stephen does. Maybe mummies and daddies can help us out. If you've got 100 men, and let's pretend that these men only have 2 meals a day, because we're on a budget, we can't afford 3 meals a day. 2 meals a day. And it costs $3 to get food and water for 1 meal. How much does it cost to feed 100 men for a day? So mathematics there. 100 men for a day, $3 a meal, 2 meals each for 100 men for 1 day. How much? Anyone want to stab in the dark guess? How much money is that one? $600, Rick says. Okay, so $600 for one day to help 100 of God's servants stay fed and watered while they're hiding from Auntie Queen Jezebel. All right? How about for a week? $600 a day, 7 days in a week, 6 times 70, sorry, 6 times, 600 times 7? 4,200, very good. How about for a whole month? Let's say 4 weeks. So that means 4 times 4,200. What's 4 times 4,200? Thank you, Auntie Treasurer. $16,800 for how long? That was for a month, right? For 4 weeks? Yep, for 4 weeks. Now, like I said, we don't know how long these men were hiding. We don't know for sure, but we do know the drought lasted for 3.5 years. And so it's possible that these men could have been hidden for 3.5 years, which is 42 months. What's 42 months times $16,800? And then we'll jump back into the story. That's a big number, isn't it? Has anybody got that much money lying around to feed 100 prophets of God for 3.5 years, assuming 2 meals a day, $3 per meal? The total, by the way, comes to almost $750,000 to feed 100 of God's men for 3.5 years. Does anybody have $750,000 lying around? I don't. I don't think Obadiah did either, by the way. So how did he do it? What would you do if you wanted to have $705,600 for an honourable purpose, but you didn't have it? What would you do? What would you do, Sam, if you wanted to help people out but you didn't have enough money yourself to help people out? What would you do? Stephen or Hannah? What? You'd ask God for help? Yes, you could do that. Obadiah may have done that. I don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us. But Obadiah decided to ask some other people to help him out. He said, "Excuse me, sir, can I please borrow some money?" "How much do you want?" "Oh, just about $600 for today. That should be enough." And then the next day, "Excuse me, sir, it's tomorrow now. Can I please borrow another $600? And we don't know how long this went for, but if it was for the 3.5 years, that's $705,000. Right. And that's, as I said, nearly $750,000. Obadiah may not have been too wealthy. He was working for the king. Remember, Obadiah, he was a steward working for Ahab. Obadiah is the one who found Elijah when Elijah went hiding and then he told everybody there'll be no rain for 3.5 years or until I say so. Obadiah finds Elijah. Elijah is then brought to King Ahab. The whole Mount Carmel experience happens, fire from heaven, all that kind of wonderful stuff. But you know what? All that money had been borrowed. And then something very, very sad happened. After they owed lots of money, then Uncle Obadiah died. He got sick and died. And his wife, Mrs. Obadiah, and some children were left with a huge debt of money, and they had no way to pay it back. Now these days, if you haven't got money to pay back a huge debt, you just say, "I'm sorry, I declare bankruptcy. I've got no money." But what happened in those days if you didn't have enough money to pay back your debts? They couldn't just say, "I'm bankrupt." They had to actually pay back that money. And if you can't afford to pay it back, how do you pay it back? They didn't have the ability to work because that was a man's job. The only hope for this woman and for her children was to be sold into slavery. Not a very nice way to live. And so the creditors, the people knocked on the door. "Mrs. Obadiah." "What?" she says. "Mrs. Obadiah, you owe me some money." And Mrs. Obadiah says, "I know I owe you some money." And the creditor says, "If you don't pay me the money, I'm going to sell you and your sons," and maybe she has some daughters as well, I don't know for sure. "I'm going to sell you and your children as slaves." Mrs. Obadiah said, please, please, no, give us a chance, we'll pay it back. And the creditor said, you better hurry up because I'm not too patient. So Mrs. Obadiah had an idea. What was Mrs. Obadiah's idea?
Pray.
I think she did pray, yes. And then she went to talk to Mr. Elisha the prophet. Going to be Mr. Elisha the prophet for us, Sam? Would that be all right? Would that be too scary? So Hannah, I want you to come to Sammy and I want you to tell Sammy your story. Hey, Mr. Elisha, I am a good lady. My husband was a good man, but he passed away and I owe lots of money. What can you do? And Sammy the prophet, Elisha the prophet, had to think about this and he said, Mrs. Obadiah, do you have anything at all that's valuable in your house? And Mrs. Obadiah thought about it and she said, well, not really. I'm a pretty poor person. But I do have one thing in my house. What did Mrs. Obadiah, you can have it for us? Mrs. Obadiah had one thing in her house. What's that, Stephen? She had a jar of olive oil. Now, we don't know exactly what kind of extract this was or how it was processed, but it could have been, we're not quite sure, but it could have been fairly expensive stuff. It could have been a special kind of a medicine, it could have been a special kind of a perfume, or it could have been oil for cooking. We don't really know, but we do know that she had a little bit. And Elisha said to her, that'll do. I want you to go around and get as many containers as you can, you and your children, and then I want you to close the door of your house and pour out whatever oil you have into those containers. So, Mrs. Obadiah and some children, is Charlie still around? I want you guys to go around and get as many containers as you can find from all over the community inside this building. Go and see all the adults, Sam, Stephen, Charlie, Hannah. Actually, Hannah can stay here. Maybe Hannah can stay because you're the mummy. Hannah's the mummy. So you can get all the containers you can find. Good job, guys. Can you find any containers too, Charlie? We need all the containers. Because we've got $705,600 to account for. Did we get all the containers that exist? Did anybody have any containers left over? Do you want to go and check again? Whoa. You guys got lots of containers here. Good job, Sam. Good job, Stephen. All right, Mummy. What did Uncle Elisha tell us to do?
Get all the oil and put them in the containers.
Okay. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to close the door. Don't let the adults see because this is top secret and stuff. And while we're doing this, mums and dads, there's a bit of a picture on the screen. I'm sorry the word's not very good there. This is from a very ancient manuscript. This is Josephus Antiquities, Book 9, Chapter 4. Okay, children, let's do this one. So the adults can't see. We're going to maybe set up all of the containers. Very good. Okay, so what's going to happen now, Mrs. Obadiah? Is the door closed? Did you guys get all the containers you could find? Not even one spare anywhere in the whole town? Great. Good job. Go for it, Mrs. Obadiah. So just go ahead and pour out your oil. Just pretend. Okay. So this one's gotten filled up. That's very good. How about this one? Is this one full? Yes. And this one? And this one? Yes. And that one? Yes. And that one? And that one? They're all full. Great. Are there any more containers anywhere? Shall we use Sammy's shoe? Should we put some more in his shoe maybe? No, that's not going to be too good. Okay. Now, when all of the containers all full? They're supposed to be full. Yeah, I can't do magic tricks, but we know that God can do some pretty amazing things. When Mrs. Obadiah finished, all of those containers were full. And something very special happened. all of those containers were completely full, and she went back to Elisha the prophet, and Elisha the prophet said, "Sell all of it." And she sold all of it. And do you know what the Bible tells us? For the mums and dads, it's in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 7 from memory. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 7. What does it say when they sold all of the oil that they had collected? Can anybody see there? 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 7. Have I got the right verse, by the way? Did I get the right verse?
Yeah.
Oh, I did. Oh, thanks. That's a relief. Go for it.
Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell yours, and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest."
Did you listen carefully to what Betty just read? He said, sell it, pay off the debt, okay, $705,600, and then what after that?
She said, "Live off the rest."
Live off the rest. How much money did she get from selling that oil? I don't know how big the debt was. The Bible doesn't tell us. I don't know how many days those men were in a cave. I don't know what it cost them those days to feed someone. I'm just trying to get some very rough tentative numbers. $3 a meal, 2 meals a day for 100 men. I don't know what the number was, but it must have been a big number. Even if it was only for a month. It was only for a year. I don't know what the time was, but it was a huge amount of expense for a small family. When the husband passes away, the wife cannot pay it. The wife goes to the prophet, and the prophet says, have faith, trust God, use what you've got, get as many containers as you have. Imagine if she'd only gotten like 2 or 3 containers. She would have got enough oil for those 2 or 3 containers, right? She would have had enough for her faith, but she got everything she could find. And she had enough to pay off her debt and to support her children for the rest of her life. So in closing, a couple of questions. First question, what can we learn from Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah and their family? What can we learn? What can we learn from that story? This is a true story, by the way. I didn't make it up. This is a true story. Josephus, the guy on that screen back there, he wasn't even a believer. He wasn't even a Christian, but he's a historian. He's telling us about the story. This story is also in the Bible, but Josephus, the Jewish historian, he also confirms the story. What does the story tell us? Put God first? Yes? Okay, that's a wonderful, wonderful observation. Does God care about people who are having a hard time? Does God care about people who are going through hardship? Think about those 100 men, first of all, that were being chased by Queen Jezebel. Did God care about those 100 people? Obviously he did. How did God help those 100 people? Through Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah. Now, after Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah helped those people, then they got into trouble. Mr. Obadiah passed away. I don't know what the circumstances were. Maybe he got old, maybe he got sick. I don't know. But he got sick, he passed away, and now the wife and children had given away all their money to help other people. Now they were in a hard time. They were in a hard place. And God also cares for widows and children. God cares about them. God cared about Mrs. Obadiah. God cared about those children who were going to be sold as slave. Do you think God likes it when we help people? Do you think God likes it when we help people? I think he does. What about if it costs heaps? I'm sorry, I got a spelling mistake there. What about if it costs us heaps of money? Is it okay to help people when it is expensive for us? Well, that's a bit of a trick, isn't it? We've got to be careful about this. Going into debt is a dangerous place to go. But sometimes we haven't got choices. I don't know the story. I don't know the details. I don't know if Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah were good with money or bad with money. I don't know. But in the end of the day, it didn't really matter. God cares about people who are good with money, and God cares about people who are also having a hard time with money. Does God care enough for single mums and children? I think we've already answered that one very clearly. Yes, he does. And does God care when we have hard times? I think the answer is obviously yes. I'd like to sing in closing a song together. And this is the song, Does Jesus Care? I think there's about 3 verses on the screen. If you can, stand with me. Let's sing together this last song. Does Jesus care? Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Charlie. We can see in our story this morning that Jesus really does care about us a lot. In the song we've just sung, we know that Jesus cares when we go through really hard times. And I want to just ask you right now to have a good hard think about this. If Jesus really cares about you that much, are you willing to trust Jesus with your life? Are you willing to put yourself into his hands and say, Jesus, I know you care for me. I want you to guide in my life. Let's pray together. Our dear Heavenly Father, we have had a very challenging story this morning. A story that takes place at a time when it's not safe to worship God, a time when people following you were hunted down and killed, a time when people went into debt and people could not repay their debts, a time when creditors came taking things away and promising terrible things because Mrs. Obadiah and her children could not pay the debts. But Lord, through all of this hardship, through all of these trials, we see that you really care about people. You care about those that surrender themselves to you. You cared about Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah. You cared about their children. And you even cared for those around them as they were going through hard times too. Lord, today some of us want to surrender ourselves to you. Some of us want you to take charge in our lives. We know you care. And Lord, I just ask that you would give us the confidence to trust you even when times are tough. I invite those with me who want to surrender their hearts to Jesus to just raise your hand in quietness and say, Lord, we want you to lead in our lives. We want you to take charge. Please be kind and gracious to us. Help us to trust you. Thank you so much that you care. That's our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.